Section 4 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 4, Imperial Antiquity, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Julius Caesar, Part 2. But the Senate was reluctant to give him the customary rewards for 10 years' successful war, and for adding Western Europe to the empire. It was jealous of his greatness and his renown. It also feared him, for he had 11 legions in his pay, and was known to be ambitious. It hated him for 2 reasons. First, because in his first consulship he had introduced reforms, and had always sided with the popular and liberal party; and secondly, because military successes of unprecedented brilliancy had made him dangerous. So, on the conclusion of the conquest of Gaul, it withdrew 2 legions from his army, and sought to deprive him of his promised second consulate, and even to recall him before his term of office as governor was expired. In other words, it sought to cripple and disarm him, and raise his rival, Pompey, over him in the command of the forces of the empire. It was now secret or open war, not between Caesar and the Roman people, but between Caesar and the Senate, between a great and triumphant general and the Roman oligarchy of nobles who, for nearly 500 years, had ruled the empire. On the side of Caesar were the army, the well-to-do classes, and the people. On the side of the Senate were the forces which a powerful aristocracy could command, having the prestige of law and power and wealth, and among whom were the great names of the Republic. Mr. Froude ridicules and abuses this aristocracy as unfit to govern the State, as a worn-out power that deserved to fall. He uniformly represents them as extravagant, selfish, ostentatious, luxurious, frivolous, Epicurean in opinions and in life, oppressive in all their social relations, haughty beyond endurance, and controlling the popular elections by means of bribery and corruption. It would be difficult to refute these charges. The patricians probably gave themselves up to all the pleasures incident to power and unbounded wealth, in a corrupt and wicked age. They had their palaces in the city and their villas in the country, their parks and gardens, their fish ponds and game preserves, their pictures and marbles, their expensive furniture and costly ornaments, gold and silver vessels, gems and precious works of art. They gave luxurious banquets, they traveled like princes, they were a body of kings to whom the old monarchs of conquered provinces bowed down in fear and adulation. All this does not prove that they were incapable, although they governed for the interests of their class. They were all experienced in affairs of state, most of them having been quaestors, aediles, praetors, censors, tribunes, consuls, and governors. Most of them were highly educated, and had traveled extensively, were gentlemanly in their manners, could make speeches in the Senate, and could fight on the field of battle when there was a necessity. They doubtless had the common vices of the rich and proud, but many of them were virtuous, patriotic, incorruptible, almost austere in morals, dignified and intellectual, whom everybody respected, men like Cato, Brutus, Cassius, Cicero, and others. Their sin was that they wished to conserve their powers, privileges, and fortunes, like all aristocracies, like the British House of Lords. Nor must it be forgotten that it was under their regime that the conquest of the world was made, and that Rome had become the center of everything magnificent and glorious on the earth. It was doubtless short-sighted and ungrateful in these nobles to attempt to deprive Caesar of his laurels and his promised consulship. He had earned them by grand services, both as a general and a statesman. But their jealousy and hatred were not unnatural. They feared, not unreasonably, that the successful general, rich, proud, and dictatorial from the long exercise of power, and seated in the chair of supremest dignity, would make sweeping changes, might reduce their authority to a shadow, and elevate himself to perpetual dictatorship, and thus, by substituting imperialism for aristocracy, subvert the constitution. That is evidently what Cicero feared, as appears in his letters to Atticus. That is what all the leading senators feared, especially Cato. It was known that Caesar, although urbane, merciful, enlightened, hospitable, and disposed to govern for the public good, was unscrupulous in the use of tools; that he had originally gained his seat in the Senate by bribery and demagogic arts; that he was reckless as to debts, regarding money only as a means to buy supporters; that he had appropriated vast sums from the spoils of war for his own use, and, from being poor, had become the richest man in the empire; that he had given his daughter Julia in marriage to Pompey from political ends; that he was long-sighted in his ambition, and would be content with nothing less than the gratification of this insatiate passion. All this was known, and it gave great solitude to the leaders of the aristocracy, who resolved to put him down, to strip him of his power, or fight him, if necessary, in a civil war. So the aristocracy put themselves under the protection of Pompey, a successful but overrated general, who also aimed at supreme power, with the nobles as his supporters, not perhaps as imperator, but as the agent and representative of a subservient Senate in whose name he would rule. This contest between Caesar and the aristocracy under the lead of Pompey, its successful termination in Caesar's favor, and his brilliant reign of about 4 years as dictator and imperator, constitute the third period of his memorable career. Neither Caesar nor Pompey would disband their legions, as it was proposed by Curio in the Senate, and voted by a large majority. In fact, things had arrived at a crisis. Caesar was recalled, and he must obey the Senate, or be decreed a public enemy, that is, the enemy of the power that ruled the State. He would not obey, and a general levy of troops in support of the Senate was made, and put into the hands of Pompey with unlimited command. The tribunes of the people, however, sided with Caesar, and refused confirmation of the senatorial decrees. Caesar then no longer hesitated, but with his army crossed the Rubicon, which was an insignificant stream, but was the Rome-ward boundary of his province. This was the declaration of civil war. It was now either anvil or hammer. The admirers of Caesar claimed that his act was a necessity, at least a public benefit, on the ground of the misrule of the aristocracy. But it does not appear that there was anarchy at Rome, although Milo had killed Clodius. There were aristocratic feuds, as in the Middle Ages. Order and law, the first conditions of society, were not in jeopardy, as in the French Revolution when Napoleon arose. The people were not in hostile array against the nobles, nor the nobles against the people. The nobles only courted and bribed the people, but so general was corruption that a change in government was deemed necessary by the advocates of Caesar. At least they defended it. The gist of all the arguments in favor of the Revolution is, better imperialism than an oligarchy of corrupt nobles. It is not my province to settle that question. It is my work only to describe events. It is clear that Caesar resolved on seizing supreme power, in taking away from the nobles, on the ground probably that he could rule better than they, the plea of Napoleon, the plea of Cromwell, the plea of all usurpers. But this supreme power he could not exercise until he had conquered Pompey and the Senate and all his enemies. It must need be that he should wade through slaughter to his throne. This alternative was forced on him, and he accepted it. He accepted civil war in order to reign. At best he would do evil that good might come. He was doubtless the strongest man in the world, and, according to Mr. Carlyle's theory, the strongest ought to rule. Much has been said about the rabble, the democracy, their turbulence, corruption, and degradation, their unfitness to rule, and all that sort of thing, which I regard as irrelevant, so far as the usurpation of Caesar is concerned, since the struggle was not between them and the nobles, but between a fortunate general and the aristocracy who controlled the State. Caesar was not the representative of the people or of their interests, as Tiberius Gracchus was, but the representative of the army. He had no more sympathy with the people than he had with the nobles. He probably despised them both as unfit to rule. He flattered the people and bought them, but he did not love them. It was his soldiers whom he loved, next to himself, although as a wise and enlightened statesman he wished to promote the great interest of the nation so far as was consistent with the enjoyment of imperial rule. This friend of the people would give them spectacles and shows, largesses of corn, money even, an extension of the suffrage, but not political power. He was popular with them because he was generous and merciful, because his exploits won their admiration, and his vast public works gave employment to them and adorned their city. It is unnecessary to dwell on the final contest of Caesar with the nobles, with Pompey at their head, since nothing is more familiar in history. Plainly, he was not here rendering public services, as he did in Spain and Gaul, but taking care of his own interests. I cannot see how a civil war was a service, unless it were a service to destroy the aristocratic constitution and substitute imperialism, which some think was needed with the vast extension of the empire, and for the good administration of the provinces, robbed and oppressed by the governors, whom the Senate had sent out to enrich the aristocracy. It may have been needed for the better administration of justice, for the preservation of law and order, and a more efficient central power. Absolutism may have proved a benefit to the empire, as it proved a benefit to France under Cardinal Richelieu, when he humiliated the nobles. If so, it was only a choice of evils, for absolutism is tyranny, and tyranny is not a blessing, except in the most demoralized state of society, which it is claimed was the state of Rome at the time of the usurpation of Caesar. It is certain that the whole united strength of the aristocracy could not prevail over Caesar, although it had Pompey for its defender, with his immense prestige and experience as a general. After Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, and it was certain he would march to Rome and seize the reins of government, the aristocracy fled precipitately to Pompey's wing at Capua, fearing to find in Caesar another Marius. Pompey did not show extraordinary ability in the crisis. He had no courage and no purpose. He fled to Brundusium, where ships were waiting to transport his army to Durazzo. He was afraid to face his rival in Italy. Caesar would have pursued, but had no navy. He therefore went to Rome, which he had not seen for 10 years, took what money he wanted from the treasury, and marched to Spain, where the larger part of Pompey's army, under his lieutenants, were now arrayed against him. These it was necessary first to subdue. But Caesar prevailed, and all Spain was soon at his feet. His successes were brilliant, and Gaul, Italy, Sicily, and Sardinia were wholly his own, as well as Spain, which was Pompey's province. He then rapidly returned to Rome, was named dictator, and as such controlled the consular election, and was chosen consul. But Pompey held the East, and, with his ships, controlled the Mediterranean, and was gathering forces for the invasion of Italy. Caesar allowed himself but 11 days in Rome. It was necessary to meet Pompey before that general could return to Italy. It was midwinter, about a year after he had crossed the Rubicon. He had with him only 30,000 men, but these were veterans. Pompey had 9 full Roman legions, which lay at Durazzo, opposite to Brundusium, besides auxiliaries and unlimited means. But he was hampered by senatorial civilians, and his legions were only used to Eastern warfare. He also controlled the sea, so that it was next to impossible for Caesar to embark without being defeated. Yet Caesar did cross the sea amid overwhelming obstacles, and the result was the battle of Pharsalia, deemed one of the decisive battles of the world, although the forces of combatants were comparatively small. It was gained by the defeat of Pompey's cavalry by a fourth line of the best soldiers of Caesar, which was kept in reserve. Pompey, on the defeat of his cavalry, upon whom he had based his hopes, lost heart and fled. He fled to the sea, uncertain, vacillating, and discouraged, and sailed for Egypt, relying on the friendship of the young king, but was murdered treacherously before he set foot upon the land. His fate was most tragical; his fall was overwhelming. This battle, in which the flower of the Roman aristocracy succumbed to the conqueror of Gaul with vastly inferior forces, did not end the desperate contest. 2 more bloody battles were fought, one in Africa and one in Spain, before the supremacy of Caesar was secured. The battle of Thapsus, between Utica and Carthage, at which the Roman nobles once more rallied under Cato and Labienus, and the battle of Munda, in Spain, the most bloody of all, gained by Caesar over the sons of Pompey, settled the civil war and made Caesar supreme. He became supreme only by the sacrifice of half of the Roman nobility and the death of their principal leaders, Pompey, Labienus, Lentulus, Ligarius, Metellus, Scipio Afrarius, Cato, Petreius, and others. In one sense, it was the contest between Pompey and Caesar for the empire of the world. Cicero said, "The success of the one meant massacre, and that of the other slavery." For if Pompey had prevailed, the aristocracy would have butchered their enemies with unrelenting vengeance. But Caesar hated unnecessary slaughter, and sought only power. In another sense, it was the struggle between a single man, with enlightened views and vast designs, and the Roman aristocracy, hostile to reforms and bent on greed and oppression. The success of Caesar was favorable to the restoration of order and law and progressive improvements. The success of the nobility would have entailed a still more grinding oppression of the people, and possibly anarchy and future conflicts between fortunate generals and the aristocracy. Destiny or Providence gave the empire of the world to a single man, although that man was as unscrupulous as he was able. Henceforth imperialism was the form of government in Rome, which lasted about 400 years. How long an aristocratic government would have lasted is a speculation. Caesar, in his elevation to unlimited power, used his power beneficently. He pardoned his enemies, gave security to property and life, restored the finances, established order, and devoted himself to useful reforms. He cut short the grant of corn to the citizen mob; he repaired the desolation which war had made; he rebuilt cities and temples; he even endeavored to check luxury and extravagance and improve morals. He reformed the courts of law and collected libraries in every great city. He put an end to the expensive tours of senators in the provinces, where they had appeared as princes exacting contributions. He formed a plan to drain the Pontine marshes. He reformed the calendar, making the year to begin with the first day of January. He built new public buildings which the enlargement of business required. He seemed to have at the heart the welfare of the State and of the people, by whom he was adored. But he broke up the political ascendency of the nobles, although he did not confiscate their property. He weakened the Senate by increasing its numbers to 900, and by appointing senators himself from his army and from the provinces, those who would be subservient to him, who would vote what he decreed. Caesar's ruling passion was ambition, thirst of power; but he had no great animosities. He pardoned his worst enemies, Brutus, Cassius, and Cicero, who had been in arms against him; nor did he reign as a tyrant. His habits were simple and unostentatious. He gave easy access to his person, was courteous in his manners, and mingled with senators as a companion rather than as a master. Like Charlemagne, he was temperate in eating and drinking, and abhorred gluttony and drunkenness, the vices of the aristocracy and fortunate plebeians alike. He was indefatigable in business, and paid attention to all petitions. He was economical in his personal expenses, although he lavished vast sums upon the people in the way of amusing or bribing them. He dispensed with guards and pomps, and was apparently reckless of his life. Anything was better to him than to live in perpetual fear of conspirators and traitors. There never was a braver man, and he was ever kind hearted to those who did not stand in his way. He was generous, magnanimous, and unsuspicious. He was the role model of an absolute prince, aside from laxity of morals. In regard to women, of their virtue he made little account. His favorite mistress was Servilia, sister of Cato and mother of Brutus. Some have even supposed that Brutus was Caesar's son, which accounts for his lenity and forbearance and affection. He was the high priest of the Roman worship, yet he believed neither in the gods nor immortality. But he was always the gentleman, natural, courteous, affable, without vanity or arrogance or egotism. He was not a patriot in the sense that Cicero and Cato were, nor Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, since his country was made subservient to his own interests and aggrandizement. Yet he was a very interesting man, and had fewer faults than Napoleon, with equally grand designs. But even he could not escape a retribution, in spite of his exalted position and his great services. The leaders of the aristocracy still hated him, and could not be appeased for the overthrow of their power. They resolved to assassinate him, from vengeance rather than fear. Cicero was not among the conspirators, because his discretion could not be relied upon, and they passed him by. But his heart was with them. "There are many ways," said he, "in which a man may die." It was not a wise thing to take his life, since the constitution was already subverted, and somebody would reign as imperator by means of the army, and his death would necessarily lead to renewed civil wars and new commotions and new calamities. But angry, embittered, and passionate enemies do not listen to reason. They will not accept the inevitable. There was no way to get rid of Caesar but by assassination, and no one wished him out of the way but the nobles. Hence it was easy for them to form a conspiracy. It was easy to stab him with senatorial daggers. Caesar was not killed because he had personal enemies, nor because he destroyed the liberties of Roman citizens, but because he had usurped the authority of the aristocracy. Yet he died, perhaps at the right time, at the age of 56, after an undisputed reign of only 3 or 4 years, about the length of that of Cromwell. He was already bending under the infirmities of a premature old age. Epileptic fits had set in, and his constitution was undermined by his unparalleled labors and fatigues. And then his restless mind was planning a new expedition to Parthia, where he might have ingloriously perished like Crassus. But such a man could not die. His memory and deeds lived. He filled a role in history which could not be forgotten. He inaugurated a successful revolution. He bequeathed a policy to last as long as the empire lasted. And he had rendered services of the greatest magnitude, by which he is to be ultimately judged, as well as by his character. It is impossible for us to settle whether or not his services overbalanced the evils of the imperialism he established and of the civil wars by which he reached supreme command. Whatever view we may take of the comparative merits of an aristocracy or an imperial despotism in a corrupt age, we cannot deny to Caesar some transcendent services and a transcendent fame. The whole matter is laid before us in the language of Cicero to Caesar himself, in the Senate, when he was at the height of his power, which shows that the orator was not lacking in courage any more than in foresight and moral wisdom. "Your life, Caesar, is not that which is bounded by the union of your soul and body. Your life is that which shall continue fresh in the memory of ages to come, which posterity will cherish and eternity itself keep guard over. Much has been done by you which men will admire; much remains to be done which they can praise. They will read with wonder of empires and provinces, of the Rhine, the ocean, and the Nile; of battles without number, of amazing victories, of countless monuments and triumphs. But unless the Commonwealth be wisely reestablished in institutions by you bestowed upon us, your name will travel widely over the world, but will have no fixed habitation, and those who come after you will dispute about you as we have disputed. Some will extol you to the skies, others will find something wanting, and the most important element of all. Remember the tribunal before which you are to stand. The ages that are to be will try you, it may be with minds less prejudiced than ours, uninfluenced either by the desire to please you or by envy of your greatness." Thus spoke Cicero with heroic frankness. The ages have disputed about Caesar, and will continue to dispute about him, as they do about Cromwell and Napoleon; but the man is nothing to us in comparison with the ideas which he fought or which he supported, and which have the same force to day as they had nearly 2000 years ago. He is the representative of imperialism, which few Americans will defend, unless it becomes a necessity which every enlightened patriot admits. The question is, whether it was or was not a necessity at Rome 50 years before Christ was born. It is not easy to settle in regard to the benefit that Caesar is supposed by some, including Mr. Froude and the late Emperor of the French, to have rendered to the cause of civilization by overturning the aristocratic constitution, and substituting, not the rule of the people, but that of a single man. It is still one of the speculations of history; it is not one of its established facts, although the opinions of enlightened historians seem to lean to the necessity of Caesarean imperialism, in view of the misrule of the aristocracy and the abject venality of the citizens who had votes to sell. But it must be borne in mind that it was under the aristocratic rule of senators and patricians that Rome went on from conquering to conqueror; that the governing classes were at all times the most intelligent, experienced, and efficient in the Commonwealth; that their very vices may have been exaggerated; and that the imperialism which crushed them may also have crushed out original genius, literature, patriotism, and exalted sentiments, and even failed to have produced greater personal security than existed under the aristocratic constitution at any period of its existence. All these are disputed points of history. It may be that Caesar, far from being a national benefactor by reorganizing the forces of the empire, sowed the seeds of ruin by his imperial policy, and that, while he may have given the unity, peace, and law to the empire, he may have taken away its life. I do not assert this, or even argue its probability. It may have been, and it may not have been. It is an historical puzzle. There are two sides to all great questions; but whether or not we can settle with the light of modern knowledge such a point as this, I look upon the defence of imperialism in itself, in preference to a constitutional government with all its imperfections, as an outrage on the whole progress of modern civilization, and on whatever remains of dignity and intelligence among the peoples. Authorities: Caesar's Commentaries, Leges Juliae, Appian, Plutarch, Suetonius, Dion Cassius, and Cicero's letters to Atticus are the principal original authorities. Napoleon III. wrote a dull life of Caesar, but it is rich in footnotes, which it is probable he did not himself make, since nothing is easier than the parade of learning. Rollin's Ancient History may be read with other general histories. Merivale's History of the Empire is able and instructive, but dry. Mr. Froude's sketch of Caesar is the most interesting I have read, but advocates imperialism. Niebher's lecture on the history of Rome is also a standard work, as well as Curtius's History of Rome. End of Section 4.